Okay, so today's daf is Ein Zayin, and we're going to start Ein Zayin in the middle of the page where we left off yesterday, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 lines from the top, which is the somewhat of a continuation of what we did yesterday, because yesterday we talked about the amount of undiluted wine that one would have to carry out on Shabbat to be liable for a korban chatat, and we said that according to Rava, since a complete cup of wine which is diluted is a revi'it, and the method of diluting wine is 3 parts water, 1 part wine, therefore a quarter of a revi'it is the amount that one would have to carry in order for it to be considered significant, the undiluted raw stuff. So now the Gemara says like this: Tana, Yavesh Bakazait. If you had dried, coagulated wine, whatever you would call that, dried wine, okay, it's made into a solid.
It evaporates. If you leave a glass, a little bit of wine, it evaporates.
Yeah, but this is if you make it into solid, right? So however you make it in solid. So Divrei Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan says that you would need a kazayit now, not a quarter of a revi'it. In other words, when it's in a liquid form, we do it relative to the liquid measure. The liquid measure is revi'it, 1/4 of a log, and a quarter of a log, basically, because you're getting a quarter of a revi'it of the undiluted wine. But once you've made it into a solid, then it's no longer a liquid. So now we go by a kazayit. It has to be a kazayit's worth, which is the volume measure for a solid, the volume of an olive. Okay? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef says, Rabbi Natan v'Rabbi Yosef v'Rabbi Yehuda amru davar echad. Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yosef v'Rabbi Yehuda said the same thing. In other words, they said that there's an equation between a revi'it and a kazayit. Because when we're talking about, in other words, we're not talking about the undiluted wine now, we're talking about the diluted wine. So when we're dealing with undiluted wine, a quarter of a revi'it is all you need, because you would normally dilute that with 3/4 of water. But when you have a complete glass of wine, how much do you need? A full revi'it. In other words, if you had mixed wine, it would be a revi'it. So what Rabbi Natan is saying, if you were to take mixed wine and turn it into a solid, however you would do that, you would need a kazayit now. You would need a kazayit you would need an olive's worth and not a liquid measure, right?
Some people hold that the reconcentrated grape juice is not a kefir or kefir anymore.
Because it's mixed with water, you mean?
Some extract matter like that.
Right. So now he's just talking about the concentrate itself. In other words, if you were to, because the concentrate is actually, let's say, I guess it's hard to compare, because he's not talking about something which is more powerful than regular wine. He's just saying if it were made into a solid somehow, you made it into a syrup. I don't know, and but concentrate is stronger than actual juice, because then you mix it with water.
Well, in regular wine, the water and the alcohol evaporates and leaves some kind of a
sediment or something. Yeah. So this is talking about, though, if you were to have somehow, I don't know, if you were to cook it or whatever you would do to make it into something thick and solid, this would be a kazayit instead of revi'it. So he says Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda said the same thing. Rabbi Natan had Amaran. Rabbi Natan is what we already said, and Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda the Tani, because we said in the following Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shishat Varim Mikulei Beit Shammai Mechumrei Beit Hillel. There are 6 things about which Beit Shammai is lenient and Beit Hillel is stringent. One is Dam Nevela Beit Shammai Mitarin Beit Hillel Mitamein. That we know that the meat of a nevela, if an animal dies without proper shechita, so it's called nevela. And now it conveys tum'ah. If you touch it, you become tameh. What about the blood extracted from a nevela? We know that about the meat of a nevela. The meat of an animal that is not slaughtered properly is tameh. What about its blood? So Beit Shammai say it's not subject to tum'ah at all. In other words, it doesn't convey impurity. Rashi says that means it doesn't convey impurity on the level of the meat. Maybe it has some lower level. But the point is, it doesn't convey tum'ah on the level of the meat of a nevela. That's what Beit Shammai says. Beit Hillel says it's the same. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says Af keshitivu Beit Hillel. Even when Beit Hillel said that the blood of a nevela would convey tum'ah, lo tivu ela badam sheyesh bo revi'it. Ho'il v'yachol likrosh v'lamor al kazayit. They only said that if the blood is a revi'it. Because what is the measurement of? Let me just get it to show.
Bring the wool.
Okay. Now the cold is back.
Are they talking about nevela of?
So what? So normally
Behema or nevela of gamke?
they're only talking about an animal, not a bird. A bird is totally different halacha of nevela. So in the case of nevela, normally it has to be a kazayit of meat to convey tumah. So how do we translate that into the blood of a nevela? We would have to say the amount of blood that, if it were to coagulate, would become a solid. And let's say if you froze it, I don't know, it would become a solid. The volume of a kazayit.
Assuming that the blood is susceptible to tum'ah.
Right, assuming that the blood is susceptible to tum'ah, like Beit Hillel says. So then you would need a revi'it, because a revi'it of blood is what will be transformed into a kazayit if you freeze it, basically, or however you want to look at it. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says, and it would seem then that Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda is agreeing with what Rabbi Natan said before. Because Rabbi Natan said before that a revi'it of wine, that a kazayit of wine, if the wine is solid, let's say if you froze it, for example, so then a kazayit of wine would be the amount you needed, because that would translate to a revi'it in liquids. Okay, so they seem to be saying the same thing. One is talking about wine, one is talking about blood, but they're both saying that a revi'it in liquid measure is going to translate into a kazayit, an olive's worth in solid measure. So now, but then Amar Abaye says, Dil Balohi, maybe that's not true. Maybe there's no equation here at all. Maybe Rabbi Natan only said his position with regard to wine, and maybe Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda only said his position with regard to blood. But they wouldn't agree. Why? Because Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Natan, because Rabbi Natan only said Hachad de ba'ir revi'it el bayayin de kalish aval badam de samich kazayit lo ba'ir. It could be that the only reason why Rabbi Natan says that a revi'it translates to a kazayit is when we're talking about wine, because wine is a thinner liquid, and therefore you don't get as much solid out of the liquid. If you were to solidify it, you wouldn't get as much from the revi'it of wine when you're translating it into a solid.
How much
so maybe that's why.
Then, because is it like doubles? What is
it's hard to. One's a liquid and one's a solid volume.
Yeah.
I think that they usually say that it's like. It was earlier in the Gemara. Didn't they say it's like 3 times? What?
Is it significant? Is it significant?
Is there a significant difference? Yeah, the kazayit would be
significantly smaller.
Would seem smaller. Yeah. Because a kazayit is like this, and a revi'it is like this. Yeah, a revi'it is going to be bigger. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So he says that when it comes to wine, that's when you have this translation of revi'it to kazayit. But maybe he would say with blood, you don't need a whole revi'it to make a kazayit, because blood is already thicker than wine. As we say, blood is thicker than water, right?
So blood is thicker than wine. It must be evaporation that you're talking about. It's not freezing.
Yeah.
Freezing, it would be the same, pretty much.
Closer. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it couldn't be freezing. You're right, because in freezing it doesn't change the volume as much. You're right.
Anyway.
You're right. That's true too. So, I was just trying to envision it. Okay, and alternatively, Inavi Adkan Lo Kama Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Hatam de Kazayit Sagele B'Ravi'it Ela B'Dam de Samich Aval Yain de Kalish Kazayit Have Yoter B'Ravi'it V'Chi B'Pik Pachot B'Kazayit L'Chayev. So what he says is like this, that you can't really draw an analogy between the opinions of Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Natan is talking about wine. It could be that by wine you require a Ravi'it to produce a Kazayit, but by blood you would require less. And alternatively, it could be that it's only that Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a revi'it of blood translates to a kazayit in solids, is only saying that with regard to blood. But with regard to wine, actually, a kazayit would be even more than a revi'it.
To produce a kazayit of what?
If you were to take the blood and make it a solid,
right?
Or if you were to take the wine and make it a solid,
so blood, it would be through coagulation, and wine would be through. Like,
we're suggesting maybe evaporation, or we don't know exactly how it's going to become a
like
solid.
Somehow
they're going to make it solid.
It would seem,
but without adding something, because what I'm thinking is that
it clots, and then it becomes.
But he says because he says yayin karush, which means seems to say that it would coagulate too. They had a thicker wine maybe than we're accustomed to, but
it would just dry up and become like that.
Apparently, it would become like that. Yeah, and obviously some would evaporate along the way. But the point is that that according to this, so you couldn't really learn from wine to blood or blood to wine, because blood to wine you could say, well, blood it only takes a revi'it to make a kazayit. Maybe wine requires more. In other words, maybe a kazayit of wine is actually more than a revi'it of wine, and vice versa. You could say that maybe a revi'it translates to a kazayit in wine, but when it comes to blood, even less than a revi'it would be a kazayit. So therefore, we can't really draw from one to the other. Now we get to a question. They asked the question: kedei gimi'ah or kedei gimi'ah? Okay, so in the Mishnah it said, how much milk do you have to carry out for you to be liable? And again, we're talking about a situation where a person accidentally carried out milk, and he realized he had a small amount of milk, and then the question is, did he carry enough that he needs now to bring a korban? So it said kedei gimi'ah, which means the amount, a sip, basically, a gulp of milk. A gulp of milk. So you could spell gimi'ah with an aleph, you could spell gimi'ah with an ayin. Which spelling is correct? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Hagmi'ini navat mai mikadech. It says in the pasuk, what did Eliezer say to Rivka? Hagmi'ini navat mai mikadech. Give me a sip, give me a gulp of water from your jug. And how is it spelled? With an aleph. So you see that it should be spelled with an aleph. They asked a question as we move to Amud Bet. Gar'inin or gar'inin? How do you spell the seeds in a fruit? Or the pit? The gar'inim. Okay, the seeds. With an ayin or an aleph? Amar Rav bar Ula said, V'nigrat me'erkecha. Where do we get the word gar'inim? Because it's something you remove when you eat the food. And ligroa, okay, garua is with an ayin, to be removed, to be deducted, to be removed. V'nigrat me'erkecha, you deduct from the value. So therefore it's an ayin. They asked the question, omemot or omemot? What is the correct language? Is it with an aleph or an ayin? When we're talking about coals that are we would call them smoldering. They're not totally on fire, but they're not out.
What difference does it make if it's ayin or aleph? Does it make a difference in the meaning?
Not really. No. They're just asking about the derivation of the word, I guess. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, Arazim lo ammemuhu began Elohim. We see the pasuk in Yechezkel says, ammemuhu with an ayin. Okay, so it says that the cedars will not diminish it in the garden of Hashem, which is talking about the political situation in the future. And it's using amamuhu to mean to cause a flame, to cause the power, the superpower of Ashur to be diminished. They asked again, later on we're going to learn that you can't close, if someone, God forbid, passes away on Shabbat, you can't close the eyes of the person who died. So is it me'amitzin with an aleph or me'amitzin with an ayin? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, ve'otzem enav mirot berah. The pasuk says, he closes his eyes from seeing evil. That's in Yeshayahu. So otzem is with an ayin. Tanu Rabbanan the Rabbi said, "Hamotzi chalav shel behema kedei gimiyah, chalav shel isha ve'loven shel beitza kedei litin b'mshifa shel kilor." It says that if you take out milk, we already said if it's animal milk, one gulp is all you have to take out to be culpable. If you took out human milk, breast milk, or you took the egg whites out, the minimum amount is the amount that you would put in a meshifa shel kilor. This was a type of application that would be put on the eye as medication, which was a smaller amount. And kilor, and the medication itself, if you had the medication, kidei l'shof b'mayim, it would the amount that you would mix with water. Because what they would do is they would take a solution of some sort, this medication, and they would mix it with water, and then that would be applied to the eye. So the amount of solution, in other words, the amount of egg white or the amount of breast milk that's considered significant is the amount that you would mix into this mixture. And if you have the mixture already, the amount of mixture that's significant is the amount that would be that would be mixed with water to be applied to the eye. Ba'ei Rav Ashi says, "Kedei shifa or kedei achiza b'shifa." When we measure the amount that you would have for one application, do we measure it in terms of the amount that is applied to the eye, or do we measure it kedei achiza b'shifa? Because when you would take this cream or this ointment and put it on your eye, obviously some would be left on your finger, so you never get it perfectly, right? There's always a little bit of residue left on the finger. So since that's the case, do we look at the amount including that extra residue or not? So this is very precise. Okay, the answer is we don't know. Okay? In other words, do we look at just the amount that's actually used? And if you carried them out, even just the amount that's actually used, that would be enough? Or do we say, no, the actual amount that you remove from the vessel when you apply it, which would include the amount that you know is going to get stuck. It's like when you pour medicine in a little cup. If you put exactly the amount, so you know there's always going to be a little bit left at the bottom, you're not actually going to get it. If you pour a tiny bit more than the ridge that you're supposed to pour up to, because you take into account that there's always going to be a little bit left on the bottom that you're not actually going to drink. At least I do that. But
That's a good idea.
Maybe I'm crazy, but when I take medicine,
The medicine tastes good.
yeah, but exactly. If it tastes bad, well,
Bubble gum syrup.
yeah, that's true. Then you want a little bit extra. Yeah. So okay. So we. So the answer. Okay. So the answer was that the amount that you're going to. So when it comes to carrying the mixture, it's the amount that you're going to go for one application, which was to 2 eyes. Okay. The amount that you would mix with water for one application. On both eyes. And then we had a question, does that include the amount that's left over on your finger or not? And that's left unresolved. Devash, the honey, we said, kedei litein al katit, that's the amount that it takes to apply to a sore on the back of an animal. Tana kedei litein al pikatit, that means on top of the sore. In other words, to put it on the surface area of the sore. Ba'ir Rav Asher said, al katit apuma de kula katit, or dilma al morasha kama de katit la poke hodrana dila. So he asked, what does it mean that the amount of honey that is considered significant is the amount that you would carry out? The amount that you would apply to a sore. Does it mean just to the highest point of the sore or the entire surface area of the sore? So he says, we're not sure about that either. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Amar Rav in the name of Rav. Kol ma shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu. Here we get to a little bit of Agadah for a little while. So he says, everything that Hashem created ba'olamo. Kol ma shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamo. Lo bara davar echad levatala. He didn't create anything that was purposeless. Bara shablul lakatit. He created the slug or the snail because if you take a slug or snail, apparently it can be used to be placed on a sore and to heal the sore. I never heard that before, but I guess so. Bara zivuv, flies, the tzirah. Is that true? Yeah, this is a slug. I don't know about that.
Probably worse.
Yeah, it could be. Zivuv latzirah. If you're bitten by a wasp, okay, or a hornet or whatever this is, you could take a fly and they would crush up flies into an ointment and apply fly to the point, and it would heal it. Yatush lenachash. Yatush is either a gnat or it's a mosquito. Is good for crushing that into an ointment and healing you from a snake bite. V'nachash lechafafit. And snake can be made into an ointment that will cure boils. Usimamit la'akrav. And simamit also, different translations have a different rendering here. One translation says simamit is just a spider. One in which case we're talking about, again, crushing spiders and applying it as an ointment for the bite of an akrav, for the bite of a scorpion. Others are saying simamit is like a gecko or something. What do you do with the snake? You're telling me that the snake is going to heal you from boils. So how does it work? So you take a black snake and a white snake, and you boil them into an ointment, and then you apply it. There are 5 fears in the world. Emat chalash al gibor, the fear that a weak person is able to impose upon a strong person. In other words, a person who thought they were strong, but now they're confronted with a weak person who intimidates them. Emat mafgia alari. A mafgia is some kind of a small animal that creates a really loud noise that scares lions. So apparently, what this is talking about is listing 5 cases where something that should normally not be intimidating intimidates the greater. Emat yatush alapil. The fear of the gnat or the mosquito that over the elephant, which Rashi explains that the gnat will go into the ear of the elephant or the nose and drive it crazy.
Right, after the drive the elephant cannot dislodge it.
But it won't be able to get rid of it, and it will go crazy. Right. That's what, and emat. simamit al ha'akrav. So this again, the simamit is either the spider or it's the gecko, makes the scorpion afraid. Ematz sinunit al nesher, the fear that the swallow is able to impose on the eagle. And emat kilbit al livyatan, and again another type of bug that goes into the ear of the livyatan. Even the large sea creature can be intimidated, can be overtaken by this little tiny creature. It reminds me of the Wrath of Khan. Remember Star Trek, if you ever watched that, where they put the things in their ear? Yeah. Anyway, so Amar Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said, "My Kara, what is the pasuk? Hamavlik shod al oz, that al az rather, that Hashem brings the shod, the one that would normally be plundered, and makes him overpower the az, the one that's strong." Okay, so in other words, there are certain cases where the small is able to overpower or to intimidate. The small is able to intimidate the large, or the weak is able to intimidate the powerful. Rabbi Zera ashkach le Rabbi Yehuda davayikaya pitchad bechamu. The Rabbi Zera found Rabbi Yehuda that was standing at the door of his father-in-law's house. V'chazia tehava b'dichadatein. So he was in a good mood. Must be that he was leaving his father-in-law's house, right? Because he was going to his in-laws, he'd be in a bad mood. But he's in a good mood. That's in-law jokes, but actually I like my in-law, but that's just a joke. And if he asked him for everything in the world, in other words, he was in a really good conversational mood. He was in a talkative mood. He could have asked him anything, he would answer. So he said, you know what, instead of asking him strict halakha, because halakha, he has to answer me. But other things, he doesn't have to answer me if he's not in a good mood, so I'm going to take advantage of the good mood. So he said to him, he said, what's the reason why goats always walk in front of the sheep? When they go out, the goats walk in front of the sheep. He said to him, because the goats are black and the sheep are white. And in the creation of the world, darkness comes before light. So goats go before the sheep. Why is it that the genitals of the sheep are covered by their tail, but the goat's tail doesn't cover its genitals? He answered, the ones that we use for clothing that cover us, cover themselves up. Meaning the sheep, because we use sheep's wool. The ones that we don't use their hair to cover ourselves up, because goat hair is very coarse. It's only used for making like bags and stuff like that. It wouldn't be used for making clothing. So it's not covered up. What's the reason why the camel has a small tail? Because he eats thorns and he doesn't want to get it caught in the thorns. That was the answer. Why does an ox have a long tail? He asked him. Because the reason is he lives in swamps and there are a lot of bugs he needs to swat with the tail. So he's giving him an evolutionary interpretation here. Why did they evolve these different things? What's the reason why the grasshopper's antenna is soft? Because he lives among reeds. And if he bumps into, if the antenna were brittle, in other words, if it were not soft and flexible, it would break, and then he would become blind. Shmuel said, he says, if a person wants to blind a grasshopper, cut off its antenna, it won't be able to fly. What's the reason? What's the reason why the eyelid of the rooster, instead of the top eyelid closing down, its eyelid closes from the bottom up? What's the reason? The daire adape v'ayel kitra mitavra, because since it lives on the rooftops and smoke rises up, it'll go blind. So it needs to have something that closes from underneath. Now we asked him a whole bunch of word derivations in Aramaic. He really was in a good mood this day, right? Dasha. Why is a door called Dasha? Because it stands for Derech Sham. This is the way in. There's the way. Dasha. Why is Darga the word for a ladder? Derech Gag, the way to the roof. Darga, Derech Gag. Matkolita. Why is dip called matkolita? Because you ask, Matai tichle da. When is this going to run out. Matai tichlez matkolita, meaning it doesn't run out because you only use it in small quantities. It's a condiment. Beta, why is a house called beta? Bo ve'etev ba. It stands for bo ve'etev, which means come sit down. Bikta, why is a small house called bikta? Because be'akta, it means a narrow house. Kofta, a kofta is either a something that they would use to grind spices or to grind things in, but they would sometimes turn it over and sit on it. Sometimes they would turn it over and sit on it, or it means something which was like a container.
In Morocco, it means hamburger.
Oh, really? So they would say kof vatev. Why is it called kofta? Because they would say turn it over and sit down. Kof vatev. So it's kofta. Livnei. Why are bricks called livnei? Livnei vanei, because they are there for your children and your grandchildren, right? Livnei vanei is like livnei vanecha for your grandchildren, meaning that you build something to last for generations. Hutza. Why is sometimes they would have like these partitions around properties that were just made of like thorn and brambles. They weren't really fences that were built professionally. Why is it called a hutza? Chatzitza, because all it is a division. It's not really functioning as a solid fence. Chatzva. Why is a large bucket called a chatzva? Shechotzev ma'im min nahar, because you dig out water. Chotzev means to dig out water from the river. Kuzah. A kuzah was a small bucket. Why is it called a kuzah? Kazeh, because it's like this. What does it mean? Rashi says that it means that since it's a small container, it's like you would say to somebody that you don't want to impose on them, just give me a little bit like this. Right? So since it's a small container, say kazeh. Shutita, why is the bundle of myrtle called shutita? Shituta, because of silliness and craziness, because people would dance with them and be crazy. Meshichla, a large basin for washing. Why is it called meshichla? Mashekula, because everybody washes from it. Mashkilta, a smaller one. Why is it called this? Why is the small wash basin called mashkilta? Mashiakalta, because that is where the bride would wash. In other words, it's more refined. The big trough is for everybody. The little one is for the royal. Asita, chaserta. So asita is, instead of a professional sort of grinding machine for grinding or for pounding spices or medicines, they would have a hand one that was more makeshift. So it's called asita because chaserta, because it's missing something. It doesn't have that extra piece. It's a one-piece thing that they would grind with, as opposed to having the two-piece mortar and pestle that had the full functionality. Buchna, bo ve'akena. So when you have the mortar and pestle, which was the one you hit with, the pestle, right? Yeah. So the hammer of it is called the buchna. And why is it called buchna? Because bo akena. Come, I'm going to smack with it. Okay. These are good derivations. Livusha. Why is clothing called livusha? Lo busha. You won't be embarrassed. Lo busha. You won't be embarrassed. Glima. Why is a cloak or a sort of what do you call it? A tunic or whatever called a glima. Shenasabo kagolem, because when you wear it, you are like without shape, because it fans out. So it's kagolem. It's like golem means like something without a shape. It doesn't mean like the golem from Prague. Golta. What's golta? Gale ve'etev. Golta means a fine cloak or a fine coat that somebody would wear. Why is it called golta? Because you would say gale ve'etev. Clear it away, and I will sit down. Meaning he doesn't want to sit down with wearing his fancy cloak because it might get dirty. So he says, I'm going to take it off first. Puriya. Why is a bed called the puriya? Sheparin v'ravina le, because of peru uravu, because this is where reproduction takes place. Bor zikna. Why is an empty pit called a bor zikna? Because bor ze naki. It stands for this pit is empty. This pit is clean. Bor ze naki. Sudra. Why is the headpiece that they would wear called a sudra? Sod Hashem l'Rav, because it was worn by the God-fearing people. So sudra is like their kippah. They would call it Sod Hashem l'Rav because of the pasuk. The secret of Hashem is given to those who fear Him. So sudra was called sudra because of Sod. Apadna. So why is the palace called Apadna? Apitchaden, because at this door all the exciting things happen. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Shlosha kozman shemazkinin mosifin gevura. There are three things that the older they get, the stronger they get. Ve'elohen dag ve'nachash v'chazir. one is a fish, one is a snake, and one is a pig. Now we get back to the halacha. So how much oil do you have to take out on Shabbat for it to be considered carrying? We said the amount of oil that would anoint a small limb. Amrei Devei Rabbi Yanai, in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai, they said that what it means is the amount of oil it takes to anoint the smallest limb of a baby who's 1 day old. In other words, the pinky finger of a 1 day old baby. They raised an objection. It said that the amount of oil has to be the amount that is needed to anoint a small limb and a child who is 1 day old. Meaning not the smallest limb of the child that's 1 day old. So my love, Ever Katan de Gadol, Ever Gadol Shel Katan Ben Yomo, doesn't it mean that the measurement is either the smallest limb on an adult, let's say the pinky of an adult, or the largest limb on the 1 day old baby? So Amrei Lach Devei Rabbi Yanai, lo. Rabbi Yanai's yeshiva would say no. Hachi Kamar, this is what it means. Shemen kedei lasuch ever katan shel katan ben yomo. What it means is that it's the amount that's needed to anoint the smallest limb, and limb of whom? Of a 1 day old baby. Lema katanae. Maybe this is actually a dispute of Tanaim. Shemen kedei lasuch ever katan vekatan ben yomo. Divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that the amount of oil that's considered significant is the amount that it takes to anoint the small limb and the 1 day old baby. And Rabbi Natan Omer kedei lasuch ever katan. All Rabbi Natan says is the amount of oil that it takes to anoint a small limb. He doesn't mention the baby. So my love, isn't this the argument? The Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar savar ever katan shel katan. The Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying that the amount of oil is the amount of oil that has to be of the smallest limb of the smallest person, basically, right? The smallest limb of the newborn baby. And Rabbi Natan savar ever katan de gadol, ever gadol de katan, aval ever katan shel katan ben yomo lo. But Rabbi Natan is saying it has to be small in only one way. Either it's the smallest limb of the adult, or it's the largest limb of the baby. So the Gemara says, lo. Lo. Everybody agrees that the smallest limb of the smallest human is not enough. As we go to Ayin Chet, and we're rejecting Rabbi Yanai. We can learn the machloket in a different way. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar savar ever katan de gadol ve'ever gadol de katan ben yomo ki hadadininu. The Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying whether you take the smallest limb of the large person or the largest limb of the smallest person, it's going to be the same. For Rabbi Natan savar ever katan de gadol ever gadol de katan ben yomo lo. But Rabbi Natan says no, you can only look at the smallest limb of a large person to make the determination. You can't assume that they're equivalent, that the largest limb of the baby is going to be the same as the smallest limb of the person. But in the end, Mai Have Allah, we gave two different interpretations of this machlokah between Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and Rabbi Natan. In one of them, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was agreeing with what the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai said, which was that it's the smallest limb of the smallest person. And Rabbi Natan was disagreeing and saying either the smallest limb or the smallest person, but not both. And in the second interpretation, everybody agreed that the smallest limb of the smallest person wasn't even the possibility. The question was, is it equivalent? Is the largest limb of the smallest person and the smallest limb of the largest person the same? Or do we say that? Do we say that the largest limb of the newborn baby and the smallest limb of an adult is the same? Or do we say that no, you only measure by the smallest limb of an adult? You don't look at the baby at all. So we don't know what the real machloket is. Is Rabbi Yanai's position even represented in this machloket or not? Because Rabbi Yanai was saying it has to be the smallest in two ways: smallest person, smallest limb. So in the end, what's the conclusion? Tashma, come and listen. The Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, because we have an explicit clarification. The Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, "Shemen kedei lasuch ever katan shel katan ben yomo." The Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar actually explicitly stated that his measurement was the smallest limb of a newborn day-old baby. In other words, a baby on the first day of its life. That is the measurement, and Rabbi Natan apparently is disagreeing with that, like the first way we interpret it. Rabbi Natan is saying, no, either the largest limb of that baby or the smallest limb of an adult. But Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying that the smallest of the smallest. And that is actually the halachic conclusion that is accepted, that is the measurement of oil that is considered significant, that if a person accidentally carried out the amount of oil that it would take, or the amount of ointment or whatever that would go on the pinky finger of a newborn baby, that's considered a significant amount with respect to the laws of Shabbat.